Welcome to the last lecture on international trade. In this segment of the lecture, we will discuss the current situation, the trade position of the United States economy in the world, and look at some of our major competitors and see where they are when it comes to international trade. One thing we need to understand is that the U.S.'s so-called trade penetration or foreign trade to GDP ratio, in other words, what percent of the U.S. economy has become attached to the imports and exports of this country. This phenomenon has doubled since the year 1980. And currently, U.S. is the country with the largest trade deficit in the world. U.S. Imports are far more than the U.S. exports. So when we look at some of the economic success stories in the world, such as Korea, Germany, or Sweden, China, or Australia, we see that they are quite different in many ways from one another. But there are four common features in all of these countries. First one of those, which is the most relevant to our discussion here, is that they all are, without any exception, are surplus countries. They register a trade surplus, meaning that they sell their products to outside more than how much they buy from other nations. A second common feature is that they also have high savings rate. So every citizen in these countries saves much more of their income than some other comparable peer countries. So this is a cultural thing here, and this is the opposite of a consumption society we have in the U.S. For example, in China, the average personal savings rate is around 45%. Whereas in the U.S. it's around 4% of income. And this is despite the fact that China has an average income that's about a fourth of the U.S.'s. A third commonality is that the work ethic is at a very high level in these countries. And lastly, level of corruption is also accordingly very low in these countries, both at government level and also in the private level. One thing we need to discuss about foreign trade is that money does not enter a country only through trade. There are some ways that also money is just simply transferred without being a part of a trade relationship. So if you think about immigrants who are sending some of their savings back to their native countries for their families to take advantage of them, and this type of money is called remittances, by the way, in economic terminology. This type of money would be an example of the non-trade money transfers that we're discussing here. Another example would be money transferred to foreign bank accounts. So especially wealthy individuals, they sometimes move some of their personal money to their offshore accounts located in tax havens, in order to avoid paying personal income taxes out of their wealth. Another term we need to be familiar with is the so-called current account balance. This is something that we hear in the news every now and then, current account. And this is simply the sum total of the trade balance and the net money transfers into a country. So the two things that we discussed so far. Trade balance is the difference between exports and imports, and net money transfers are the difference between money entering into the U.S. from abroad minus the money leaving the U.S. For any reason. So in economic literature, the current account surplus to GDP ratio is considered to be a positive thing. So this current account balance needs to show a positive number, not a negative number, and higher the better in comparison to GDP. So more of the national economy has to be coming from balance and trade balance and net money transfers for an economy to do well. When we look at this ratio, this important ratio, current account balance to GDP ratio, we see that some of our main competitors are at a pretty good shape when it comes to this. China has a 10% current account balance to GDP ratio, Germany 7%, Russia 6%, Korea 5%, Sweden 3%, and unfortunately US's current account balance shows a deficit of 3%. So this makes the US the world's largest trade deficit economy. And so what are the reasons for this? Because if we understand the reasons, then we can create policies to address those reasons and reverse this negative trend. First and foremost, what sociologists call mindless consumerism is an underlying sociology here. And this simply refers to consumers making unconscious choices without considering the consequences of their economic decisions. So for example, when we go to a grocery store and see, let's say we are to buy a shampoo and we see a bottle that's made by Dove company, which is a US company, and another bottle made by L'Oreal, which is, I believe, a French company. And they're both of their prices might be the same. Let's imagine they're the same, $4 a bottle, or I don't know, $3 a bottle. And so a mindless consumer just simply picks one. He doesn't consider the consequences of his decision. Whereas more mindful consumers, such as a person like yourselves now who have taken an econ course and understand these relationships, would choose the US made one. Because with the US made shampoo, the Dove shampoo, all the profits that are made after the sales would stay inside the US, stimulating the economy here. Whereas with the L'Oreal brand, the profits would go back to France, leaving the US and making French economy richer by that amount and us poorer by that amount, purely on monetary terms. So if they sell for $3 and let's say the cost of production is $2.25, this means there's a 75-cent profit made out of each bottle of shampoo sale, and those 75 cents stay here or leave the country. So in a society with mindless consumers, unfortunately, the imports tend to be higher, and this also hurts the economy. Secondly, U.S. economy's dependence on oil is another culprit to blame here. We use so much of our oil in so much of our industrial production and also personal consumption that the U.S. imports enormous sums of oil from other countries, even though it is the second country with most oil production in the world, right behind Russia and right before Saudi Arabia. Yes, the U.S. continues to import vast sums of oil from abroad. This creates a large trade deficit every year because it's a huge sum of imports that enters our GDP calculations as a minus calculation. That's the money, that much of money leaving the US economy and going somewhere else. A third reason, argued reason, is that the Chinese government's exchange rate policy. Chinese money is called renminbi, and one unit of renminbi is called yuan. And Chinese government, since 1974, until recent years, adopted a exchange rate policy, and they pegged the yuan to a dollar at the rate of $1 being equal to $8.74. 8.74 yuans. So, in other words, pegging means fixating the value of a national currency to the value of another currency. And this policy is argued to create a trade deficit for the U.S. because if they didn't fix the exchange rate value, then Chinese economy's fast growth would translate into Chinese money, yuan, appreciating faster, and as a result, Chinese products being more expensive for U.S. consumers and U.S. products being cheaper for Chinese consumers, and therefore U.S. would export more to China and import less from China, creating a smaller trade deficit with China. So this argument has been there for a while, but I have to add here that the evidence is mixed on this. There are some research that also shows that this Chinese pegging policy did not really keep the exchange value of renminbi as much as it's argued. So now we know the problem. So what are the solutions? How to correct the U.S.'s deficit problem, in other words? First and foremost, economics education. So just like what you're doing here, more and more people take education in economics, we would create a society with conscious consumers or mindful consumers, and that would lead to less consumption and more of that consumption being US-made products. And also we would drive less and buy more gas-efficient cars as a part of it, and reduce our oil dependence and oil imports further. And then government policies to encourage more export-oriented production is certainly another factor here. Here you see in the picture that President Obama a few years ago, when he was the president, he approved a large-scale subsidy for Chevrolet, so they built an all-electric car that's affordable by ordinary people and that has a long range. And as a result, Chevrolet produced a model called Bolt, and it's a fully electric car that goes about 235 miles on a single charge, and it's at sells for a very affordable $35,000 range, which is significantly less than some of its competitors out there. So it is a car that has a very bright future in the U.S. And these types of government policies to encourage more export-oriented production is also beneficial. And not surprisingly, Chevrolet's biggest market today has been China, not the U.S. economy. China, with 1.3 billion people, with a very rapidly rising income level, and a culture that gives car ownership a higher status, is a very beneficial thing for U.S. exports. Another thing that can be done is more regulations by the Congress, because as we discussed before, regulations are a somewhat acceptable form of trade restrictions, because it doesn't attract retaliation, and it also creates some sort of a utility for the society, especially when they're about environmental issues. So that's definitely one idea to explore. And lastly, we can mention that foreign policy, if the U.S. foreign policy could be converted into a more internationally agreeable form, then it would boost the image of the U.S. abroad, which would lead to more consumption of American products outside the U.S., making the U.S. exports higher and fixing the trade deficit problem we have in this country.